Something that can really set a scene apart is a monochromatic look. And in this video, I'm going to cover how to get the blue monochromatic look from Blade Runner, the 1982 version. Your video will go from this to this very quickly, very easily. I'm going to show you a very simple process to get this done. For those of you that are new to my channel, I'm Fred Trevino. I'm a professional colorist. I've been grading for Beambox Studio in New York City for 15 years. I've graded about 60 feature-length films and hundreds of short projects for companies like HBO, Google, ESPN, Sundance, Under Armour, just to name a few. This channel is about the creative side of color grading. There's plenty of channels out there that deal with all the technical stuff like color spaces, monitors, things like that. But here I want to focus on what really gets you work, what really makes your film stand out, and that's things like color story, what's the best look for your scene, creating cinematic looks. And so with that being said, let's jump right in.
This intro intentionally left blank.
Okay guys, so here we are going to create this Blade Runner monochromatic look from the 1982 film. So let's jump right in here, and here is the clip that we are going to apply the look to. And so if you've seen any of my videos, you know that I initially like to compare the two and just kind of let you know how a colorist thinks and how we kind of compare the two images to see what needs to happen. So this one's pretty easy. The first thing that I'm noticing is obviously this shot is way too warm compared to this shot. So when I looked at both of these, you know, the first thing that I want to do first to kind of get my bearings is just do a basic color temperature adjustment, cool this shot down here. And that was done very easily by going into the primary tools and just basically cooling that shot down. That's all that was done. Okay, and so then the next thing that I noticed that needs to happen is obviously with this monochromatic look, what you notice is things like, the things that would typically be shadows or blacks in an image all have a shade of blue. And then the midtones also have kind of a shade of blue leaning a little bit towards maybe the magenta side. And then the highlights or the brighter parts of the image like this have a little bit of a teal or green to them. So this is a monochromatic look in the cooler side of things, but it really goes from having a kind of darker, deeper blue kind of like this to a teal look kind of like this. And then you can see the skin tones and, part of the skin tones kind of are somewhere in between. So to kind of get this look here, again, we've only done from here to here. I used the offset tool, just a primary offset tool right here. And I pushed it towards kind of the teal kind of green look. And that created this look here. So we went from this to this. And you can see everything is just little steps, one at a time, from here to here. And then the next thing that I noticed, we started to really start getting into the details of things. Kind of like I mentioned, in the shadows, right now these shadows are a little bit too perfect, a little bit too black. And I really want it to be more on the bluer side of things. Okay, so going into the HDR tools, and then if I turn this on and I blow this up, you can see that in the shadows, we start adding some blues to it. And let me show you how that was done in the HDR tools here. If we click and hold on the shadows, that's the area that was affected. However, for this, in this specific situation, I actually had to open up here, the adjustments here, the different zones. What actually happens is I then went in and controlled the max range and then also the fall off, so that I can only affect the hair. So if you do that and then you expand the tools here, you can see that it will show you exactly what you're affecting. And then as you adjust the range, you can see that you can start affecting different parts of the image. And I believe when I first started adjusting the shadows, it was affecting a pretty large portion about that. And then I dialed it all the way back here so that I'm only affecting only the shadows. And if I do that, you can see I rolled back the max range so that I'm only affecting the hair, which is all I wanted to affect. And then with the fall off, it's just kind of a fine tuning of that, which I also controlled like that. And that's what allowed me to dial in only on the hair. Very cool tool. So that I only adjust the hair, and it's all these little steps, little by little. And then now I also remember I actually brought up the exposure on the hair just a touch, just because it was a little bit too black here, and I brought it up. And then the similar thing that I did with the darks using the HDR tool, I then went into the light so that I can affect just the skin tones and just the brighter parts of the image. And so if I turn this on here, and as you can see, there's always a step in a grade where it kind of takes that shift and starts getting much closer. And I think this was it. You can see we're starting to get closer and closer to the look. And this was done in the exact same way as the darker tools, HDR tools here. And then once again, let me compact that. You know, if you go to this little guy here, you can expand the controls. And I did the same thing here where I hit Shift H to see what's being affected. And then, you know, I adjusted these to dial in the parts of the skin tone that I wanted to dial in. And then I also tweaked the fall off to dial that in like that. It's a really powerful tool. And that allowed me to only affect those parts of the skin. And then if I start comparing it again to the original Blade Runner image, we're getting closer. Here's the Blade Runner image, and here we are. And we've kind of come a long way at this point. You can see there, we're getting closer. And so the next thing I noticed is that this image was a little bit too much in the blues in terms of a monochromatic image. And this one is leaning more towards the greens in a monochromatic image. And if I toggle between the two, I think you'll see that. And so what I did is adjust the hue to bring this more in the green direction. You can see before, after, before, after. And that was just a simple adjustment. You know, really you could have done it in the color wheels or the HDR tools. I just happen to be in the HDR tools. So I just simply adjusted the hue like this, more into the green directions. And now if I toggle between the two, you'll see that they're both more on the greener side of a monochromatic look. Like that. And then by this point, you know, I thought we were in a good place to do a look adjustment, which is what I did here. And I just kind of felt that this image was a little bit too bright, not a very cinematic level of luminance. You know, this image here does have a lot more blacks in shadows. Really, a lot of it is the shadows, and it kind of has a natural contrast to it because of this streak of light here. But I wanted to have this kind of feel of more darkness in the shot. This was a little too bright for me, so I ended up going in here and adjusting the exposure, bringing it down, you know, and I did again the HDR overall exposure here, but I also went and adjusted the contrast in the image as well to kind of, you know, go from this kind of brighter kind of daylight look to something that looks a little more ominous, a little darker, a little bit more cinematic. And again, always love toggling between the two. We go from here, you can see the feel. This is where we start kind of dabbling a little bit into the feel of these shots and not so much, you know, going into these very specific, you know, color tones. You know, again, it was here before, exposure and contrast, to here, to something a little moodier. And then, you know, here we're kind of towards the end, and I kind of felt, again, to kind of start leaning more into the cinematic aspect of it. For this one, I just simply added grain. And I added the DaVinci Resolve grain, you know, very subtle. You can kind of see it. This is one of those things, again, you may not even be able to see over YouTube. You can kind of see it on her cheek a little bit. Before grain, after grain, very subtle. And it really, you know, I can see it on my display, but really it's just a very subtle amount of grain so that we can start getting closer to this. And then I still kind of felt that it was missing something. It's still, you know, it's still looking, it looks good. And it's kind of that same idea of, you know, obviously you can't completely replicate this because it's a totally different shot, but it's definitely in the same world. But I felt it still needed something to kind of give it this sort of magical feeling that Blade Runner has. And so I added an OFX plugin called Lens Reflections, which is not color grading, not color correction, but that just goes to show you that sometimes you need, you know, a little bit of these visual effects that DaVinci Resolve has. And so by adding this lens reflection, it just kind of gave it this little boost, you know, which this lens reflection kind of, as the name says, you know, kind of gives the impression of like lights hitting the lens, and it's causing these kind of reflections that kind of help soften the image, and it gives it, you know, moving like sort of like lens flares. You see, if I turn it off, it's like that. And then if I turn it back on, it just adds this kind of nice kind of glow to it. This kind of cool sort of stuff. And so again, this was lens reflections, and then the OFX plugin. I actually, you know, did pretty minor adjustments. I just kind of adjusted the global brightness a little bit, but the biggest adjustment that I made is honestly changing it from, you know, the default color, which I believe was a dark blue, into this kind of teal color to kind of help boost the highlights and kind of match these highlights a little bit better. So I mainly adjusted that, and then in the global blend, rather than keeping it at 100, which was that, I kind of brought back the effect a little bit. And this is the kind of thing where image by image, depending on your clip, you just kind of play with it yourself and, you know, add whatever look you want to add to it in terms of the reflections. I did very minor adjustments and really just, you know, changed the color of it and the intensity. And then, so let's see what we actually did again. If I turn everything off. Okay, so this is where we started here. You can see how orange it was. And then it was just basically cooling it down overall, doing the offset, adjusting the HDR blacks, shadow areas, adjusting the highlights. Okay, and then teal, adding teal, adjusting the hue so that we push it more in the teal green direction. And then the look adjustment to give it a cinematic punch, and contrast and exposure. Grain, you may not be able to see as much. And then the lights. And this is kind of a look inspired by Blade Runner, a monochromatic look. And, you know, following these concepts for your clips is really all you need to do. Is just think of your image, break it down part by part, shadows, midtones, highlights, and just doing what you can to bring it close to whatever look you're trying to create. So that's it. I'm sure you learned a lot, and I'll see y'all next time. Okay, so that's it. What I would really want you to take from all of my videos is to really be creative with your color grading, focus on what pushes your story forward, what makes your project stand out, create your own unique looks, use films as inspiration, but don't try to completely mimic something else, because that usually never works. Take inspiration, make it into your own, have it become your own look for your specific project. And so thanks again, check out my other videos, like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.